Good evening. My name is Paul Williams, here on blogging Theology. It's 8 o'clock in the evening here in France, and I am very honored and happy to welcome Dale Martin, Professor Dale Martin, who is in Texas, USA. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon or morning or whatever it is.
It's all very confusing.
Time is all relative.
It is. I forget who once said that. Yes, it is. So today we are going to tackle one of the most interesting subjects, I think, in New Testament studies, and that is the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. This is in a way, a single work or a work by one person, and I'll let Professor Dale Martin describe in detail what that's about. But I'm just going to quote the overview from his book, New Testament History and Literature, published by Yale, which I do recommend very much. And in the overview, Dale writes, Luke and Acts, 2 volumes of one work, are structured very carefully by the author to outline the ministry of Jesus and the spread of the gospel to the Gentiles. The Gospel of Luke emphasizes the themes of Jesus' Jewish piety, his role as a rejected prophet, and the reversal of earthly status. The Gospel of Luke ends in Jerusalem, and the Acts of the Apostles begins there and then follows the spread of the movement to Samaria and the Gentiles. By closely analyzing the Gospel of Luke and Acts, we see that the author was not concerned with historicity or chronological order. Rather, he writes his orderly account to illustrate the rejection of the gospel by most of the Jews and its consequent spread to the Gentiles, end quote. So that's very interesting survey, and there's so much there to unpack. But can I just begin, if I may, asking you about the question of authorship and the date of this huge work in the New Testament?
Let's go with the most easy thing first, which is the date.
Right.
We know that whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke used the Gospel of Mark as one of his sources. We think, or at least I think, that we can date the writing of the Gospel of Mark, or at least its publication. Now, you have to realize that in the ancient world, publication doesn't mean the same thing as it does in the modern world. Publication just meant a bunch of scribes copying things down and sending them out to their friends.
Right.
But let's date the Gospel of Mark at around the year 70, just because he predicts in Mark 13 the surrounding of Jerusalem by the Romans, but he does not depict the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem was destroyed. One of the things that scholars use to try to figure out when does a prophetic text date itself is to say, when does it go wrong?
Interesting.
Because prophetic texts always give you a past history to try to make you believe that they're dependent, that they're dependable.
Wow.
But then when you get to the point where the prophecy goes wrong, that's when you date the document. It's worked for Daniel, the book of Daniel.
Yeah.
We can say Daniel was written in 164 BCE. That's very unusual to be able to date any ancient document to that. But it's because he predicts the surrounding of the temple, but not the rest of the things that happened. His predictions just start going wrong. And that's when you date the document. So it's very useful. But anyway, Mark is almost certainly has to be dated to around the year 70, because then his predictions go wrong. And so if Luke used Mark as a source, then you must suppose, scholars argue about this all the time, what must you suppose? But if Luke knows something about Mark, but Mark was published around 70, then does that mean Luke can come before 80? Because you have to have time. It's not like the Wall Street Journal comes out and tells you what the top 10 reading is. You have to have time for books to circulate. They have to be copied hand by slaves, usually, and then copied and copied and copied, and then sent out and taken out by actual human persons, carrying them to their friends. I mean, how long does it take to get from Mark to Luke?
Mm-hmm.
And then Mark to John?
Mm.
So we scholars are just in a guessing game. But I think that Luke and Acts is so fascinating because it's a 2-volume that came out, I would say, 40 years after the death of Jesus and 50 years after the writings of the Apostle Paul.
Fair enough. And Luke portrays knowledge of the events in AD 70 that Mark, in Mark 13, has some knowledge of, but not complete knowledge. But Luke fills out some further information about armies circling or attacking Jerusalem, which betrays a contemporaneous or historical knowledge of those events, which he then colors and fills in, which is absent from Mark. So that dates him after Mark, obviously. Although when
according to Mark, the Roman armies surround Jerusalem just around the year 69 or 70, because the temple's not destroyed yet. There's been no abomination of desolation, idolatrous object raised in Jerusalem at that time. So we can be pretty sure about when Mark is dated. And, it's just, then Luke comes along and he says, oh, well, no, it's not going to all happen immediately. Yeah. First, you have to have the Gentiles surround Jerusalem and tramp it down. And he basically predicts the destruction of Jerusalem, which had not happened when Mark was written. And then he says the time of the Gentiles. He has a technical term for the extension of eschatological apocalyptic time. This is what happens in these kinds of religious writings, is that time just gets stretched out. And so that's what you get. And Luke is Mark's timetable just doesn't suit him anymore. Because he's looking around himself and he's going, well, wait a minute, the Romans aren't here. Why are we still doing this thing that we're doing? And so Luke extends the time between what Mark had said and what he says. So the times of the Gentiles are Luke's technical term, which he probably just invented himself, for a time between the different comings of Jesus, really.
And of course, it's a very elastic term, because what is this time of the Gentiles? Is it a decade, 100 years, a millennium? There's kind of no limit to it.
No, the people in the church I grew up in said we were living in the time of the Gentiles.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really struck me when I first read about the Gospel of Luke and Acts as well in New Testament scholarship was this extraordinary discovery that scholars have made. Discovery is the right word, but it's there in the text, that unlike Mark is very clear that Jesus was an atonement. That Mark has a doctrine of the atonement. In Mark 10:45, Jesus, as the Son of Man, is a ransom for many, is offered as a ransom for many. But in Luke, who uses Mark, that particular verse is omitted. And there are other verses also in Mark that seem to be either altered or omitted to remove this sense of Jesus being an atoning sacrifice for sin. So it appears that Luke doesn't have this doctrine. He rejects it in a way because he's clearly edited or redacted the text he is using, which does have that doctrine. And you find this also in Acts, I think, and you point this out in the sermons attributed to the apostles, Peter, and so on. Nowhere does it say, I think, that Jesus's death was an atonement for sin, an atoning sacrifice, and through that death itself, people are reconciled to God. No, there's another way that people receive salvation, which perhaps you could explain what this mechanism is. How is it people are saved, if not through the death of Jesus as an atoning sacrifice? So this is something that is a great surprise to people, I'm sure, to learn that according to Luke, Jesus's death is not in itself the actual cause of reconciliation with God. Is that correct, you think?
Yes, that's quite correct. But I mean, so I'm sorry, my brain is exploding. You've hit on so many important issues. One of the most important is that Luke Acts is one of the most astounding documents in history, in my view. You said when we first started talking about that Matthew was your favorite gospel. And I remember thinking, Matthew, are you kidding me? Matthew is boring. Now, Luke is interesting. But part of it is because you've got two documents. You've got two volumes. A volume could only be about what you would roll up on a scroll.
Mm-hmm.
And if you notice, both Luke and Acts are about the same length.
Right.
Which is probably because they could each be rolled up on a scroll that you could handle. Now, of course, you could make a scroll as big as you wanted, which is why we see, these paintings and pictures of the Jewish Torah on a huge scroll.
Yeah, massive.
That, has two sticks that go out forever,
Yeah.
But that's not a normal scroll.
No.
And so the book of Luke and the book of Acts could each occupy easily one scroll. And I think that's why they were put out differently.
Yeah.
But that's not the only reason, because Luke is so clearly fashioned as a biography, not a modern biography, but an ancient bios, we call it, a life.
Yeah.
Because there are certain things that a bios was supposed to include. You had to include the child's birth and its genealogy, because he had to be descendant from respectable people. Then you had to have his upbringing as from his nursery, and then his going to school, and his going to high school and rhetorical school, and then his becoming the great political figure that he was. And it didn't matter whether you were writing about, look at Plutarch. Plutarch was this writer who wrote around the year 100, 120. And he wrote an entire series of parallel lives. He would take a Greek and a Roman. So Julius Caesar and, well, who would be Julius Caesar's? Alexander the Great. So he would pair two great figures, one from the Greek world, one from the Roman world. And then he would illustrate all of their virtues and their flaws. And it's just such moralistic, writing that I find myself thinking, how could we ever escape from that? How could I ever write about Paul or Jesus in a parallel context without falling into some kind of trap?
Mm-hmm. So coming back to this idea of Jesus as what is the mechanism by which people are saved in the preaching of Acts and in Luke's redaction and rewriting of Mark and adding his own material, of course, Q and other matters? what is the message? How are people saved then for Luke if it's not by this atoning sacrifice?
Well, and I'm sorry, I got distracted by talking about the literary structures of Luke and Acts and kind of got distracted from your original question, which was, what do you do about the, the death of Jesus?
Yeah.
Well, I just think that and I don't know why different early disciples of Jesus wanted to take different tracks in interpreting the death of Jesus as either a sacrifice or a not sacrifice, an atonement or a non-atonement.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that I can think probably is the case, and this is something that some grad student needs to spend a lot of time working on. Were there anti-atonement forms of Judaism at the time? And what did they look like?
Mm.
So could part of Christianity have developed out of an anti-atonement kind of Judaism? I mean, no, I don't think you can make any case that any form of Christianity in its earliest sense, it came out of a non-Jewish background. I think it has to be Jewish. But that doesn't tell you what kind of Jewish. And I don't even, so there are parts of the Hebrew Bible that don't emphasize the atonement.
Yeah.
But what they emphasize is the dramatic example of the prophet of God, the holy man who's able to heal by putting his mouth on a corpse.
Yeah.
But he's also a prophet in the sense of Isaiah and Elijah were prophets.
Yeah.
And so that's what Luke and Acts is coming out of.
Because there seem to be at least a couple of strands in what we call the Old Testament. There is the temple focused strand, the cultic strand, but also almost an anti-temple strand.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that any person that goes to seminary should have seen their first year in introduction to the Hebrew Bible is these two real conflicting forces of pro-temple and anti-temple. I mean, it's all over the place in the Psalms.
Yeah. It's quite surprising. And it's there in Acts as well. The first martyr, the proto-martyr, Stephen, his long rambling speech is quite anti-temple in many ways. And it certainly upset the Pharisees, the religious authorities, that they had him killed.
Yeah, he basically is against two things. The Mosaic Torah and the temple.
Yeah. So
and he wants that's why I say, but the fact is, if you look at all the rest of Luke and Acts, the narrative argues against that. It has Jesus and his family super pious toward the temple.
And Paul as well, who's a good Torah observant Jew, which is
absolutely.
Have you not met Paul and read his letter to the Galatians? I mean,
he makes a vow according to Acts.
Yeah.
And pays for 3 other guys to, fulfill their vows. And you just go, does this sound like Paul of the letters? Well, maybe it does. I mean, I am of the kind of opinion that Paul could be so fucked up that we would never understand it.
Okay.
But I do think he was complicated, and I don't think that we can make him consistent.
That seems to be a great reticence on behalf of many scholars who just to admit that he might just not be consistent. He might just do one thing in Romans, another thing in Galatians, another thing somewhere else. And the desire to harmonize and make him seems to be a presupposition of so much exegesis. And I'm thinking, hang on, but let Paul be Paul and have his word. And it's messy and complicated, as you say.
Yeah.
So in terms of forgiveness, then, is the way that people are forgiven for Luke and in the preaching in Acts simply by repentance to God?
Yes. Repentance, I think repentance is very strong in Luke and Acts.
Right.
And simply striving to be the proper prophetic person.
Right.
And I think that's almost a universal call in Luke and Acts. It's not like only certain people can be prophetic. I think Luke and Acts tries to give forth the feeling that that's the meaning of Christianity, is being prophetic. Speaking out for the poor, speaking against the rich, speaking, justice and these kinds of things. And so I just find Luke and Acts interesting for so many reasons, including the literary reasons, the theological reasons, the reasons that it departs so much from other aspects of the New Testament, such as the idea that there's no atonement in it. That's it.
Can I just ask?
How do you have Christianity without atonement?
Well, exactly. So we're looking here at the elephant in the room. It's there in plain sight, and yet no one sees it, which is a non-atonement Christianity in the New Testament, in a gospel itself, and preached by Jesus, preached by Peter, the apostles. They're all preaching it, and yet it doesn't register. The Catholic Church still does what it does, and the evangelicals still preach what they do. And but can I just ask? It's a slightly random question. I'm just looking at in the end of the Gospel of Luke on the road to Emmaus story. I'm not concerned whether or not it's historical, but it's obviously Jesus. These guys are walking to or from Jerusalem, talking about what's happened. They've heard about Jesus and about his death, and then Jesus walks along with them, and Jesus says, "Are you?" Sorry, they say, "Jesus, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" And Jesus asked them, "What things?" And they, the disciples, say, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty indeed, and word before God and all the people." Now, the reason I'm highlighting this is this, do you think, what Luke believes about Jesus coming at the end here, that he was a prophet, mighty indeed, and word before God? What I'm trying to get at, we don't see here the second person of the Trinity, do we? We don't see here the divine Son who becomes human in the womb of Mary. So is this Luke's Christology in a nutshell there, or is that cherry picking in a irresponsible way?
No. I always try to teach my students, never ignore how a book begins and how the book ends. Any good writer, now there are a lot of bad writers, but any good writer will give you signals at the beginning of the book and the end of the book.
Right.
Because, we're told, don't bury your lead. Come out with the strongest thing you have to come out with, and then end with the strongest thing you can end with.
Right.
That's what we're taught, and for good reason.
Right.
That's how I've taught writing over the years.
So for Luke, Jesus was a mighty prophet of God, and God did amazing miracles and signs and wonders through Jesus. I'm actually paraphrasing Acts 2:22 here, of course, which is also by Luke. Mighty in word indeed. Okay. Now, one of the arguments used against your position, the idea of a non-atonement Jesus in Luke, is the story of the Last Supper, of course. And that's found, just trying to find it. The so-called, I'm looking at the New Revised Standard Version here, the institution of the Lord's Supper, where Jesus says in the main text here, I'm not looking at the footnote, of course. Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He did the same with the cup after supper, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." Now, that's in the text of the Bible, in the NRSV. Does this not counter your view of a non-atoning sacrifice of Jesus in Luke?
Okay, well, you didn't actually point out where you thought it was atonement theology.
Okay,
so if I say something, this is for you, that in itself is not atonement. It could mean a million things. This is the problem with people who tried to read certain texts of scripture as settling their own meaning. Like the text, all I have to do is quote back to you the text and that settles the meaning.
Yeah.
Well, no, it doesn't. The meaning is not settled that easily. And so we have to talk about what the meaning of the text is. And the meaning of the text may change, and it may be complicated, it may be multiple. So I know exactly what you're saying. People have just read this. This is for you. This is my body, which is given for you. Well, you just dump all atonement theology into it. Whereas historians are supposed to pick things out and say, well, where could this meaning come from? And where could this meaning come from? And do all these meanings all converge on the same place? Or do we need to pick out different meanings? So I think all you have to do is take Matthew and Mark and set them together. They're kind of very similar when it comes to this issue of atonement. And also when it comes to the chronology of their Gospels. And then you take Luke and Acts and you set it over here. And it's also different with chronology. It's messed around with the chronology all over the place. Transposed chronology.
Yeah.
And different theology. And then you get John over here. I mean, John is a totally different story, really. I mean, so look at these piles of data that you have. And I just viewed my job as a historian of the Bible to try to deal with these different piles in as honest a way I could.
Right. Because there is a footnote at the bottom of this passage in Luke 22, which says, other ancient authorities lack in whole or in part, verses 19b to 20, which is given in my blood. So some have argued that, in fact, the blood atonement, that is the belief of some Christians in the first century, is not really there in Luke. It's been added by a later scribe.
Yes.
And even though it is in other ancient manuscripts, but given Luke's overarching absence of any blood atonement, this looks like a scribal interpolation, an addition.
And the best argument for that comes from my friend Bart Ehrman, Ehrman. And he and another scholar, whose name is slipping me at the moment, I'm sorry, wrote an article arguing that the part in Luke about Jesus's blood, sweating blood, was a later addition to try to make the passion in Luke more like the passion in the other Gospels.
Right.
That is, as an atonement. And then that got included in one of Bart's books. So it's easy to find. It's in one of the books that he published recently, but it's also published as an article that you could probably find online.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's really interesting to see he and this other guy traced back the different scribal changes to all of those texts as they tried to make Luke look more like Matthew and Mark.
Right. So there's been a later scribal attempt to harmonize and bring into conformity Luke, who perhaps originally was a bit of an oddball, wasn't quite towing the proto-orthodox line. But I just wanted to stress in the earlier Gospel of Mark, which scholars pretty much universally believe Luke used when he was writing his own account, in Mark's Gospel in 10:45, we have the verse, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." It's a key verse, and we find it in Matthew as well, I think. But oddly, it's missing from Luke, suggesting to many scholars that Luke deliberately excised it, omitted it from his account. And that tells us something about Luke's agenda, what his understanding of Jesus' death was. So because for Luke, of course, Jesus certainly did die on the cross and rose again from the dead. What was the point or significance for Luke then of Jesus' death on the cross, do you think?
Oh, man. You're asking someone who's not an expert. I do not consider myself an expert on Luke. I mean, you would think that as a New Testament scholar, you're only responsible for like a book that's about that thick. So, you would think that saying, oh, I know all about Paul, but I don't know about Luke is kind of special pleading. And I'm sure it may be. But there are several things that occur to me about Luke related to your question that I guess I'd want to spend a whole lot more time looking at, including even the manuscript tradition. That is, how did the different Greek manuscripts get transcribed and changed the way they did, and how is it translated into Latin? But I mean, quite briefly, what your question just exposes is how interesting the field of New Testament studies is, because we've got these different gospels that the more we read them, the more we think they disagree with one another rather than agree with one another.
Indeed, I mean, there's actually in Mark, at the death in Jesus' death in Mark, you have a centurion or a Roman soldier saying, "Truly, he was God's son," as the NRSV says, or it says in the bottom, "Truly, he was a son of God." Yeah,
a son of God, exactly.
But then in Luke's version, exactly the same story. He's obviously familiar with Mark for the reasons we mentioned. He has, "Truly, he was an innocent man."
That's right.
So interesting switch there. He's no longer God's son. He's an innocent man.
It goes along with what I've been trying to say about Luke's Christology.
Right.
Jesus is a prophet. He's a great prophet, and he's a healer.
Yeah.
But Luke's not going to go the Trinitarian route yet.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's a very important change when he takes Mark's a son of God, which could be interpreted in itself many different ways.
Yeah.
And changes that to an innocent man. Mm-hmm. That's super important for Luke.
Yeah, because there's that crucial moment of the death of Jesus. You have a Gentile proclaiming the significance. This man was innocent of any crime. Not he was a sin offering, or behold, God has died for our sins, or anything like that. No.
And of course, but that's the genius of Luke Acts, I think, is that just foreshadows everything that's going to happen in Acts. Mm-hmm. That scene is like, it's. I just can't believe the guy consciously constructed it this way. But it sounds like it was consciously constructed to have the last scene in Luke be all of Acts.
Right. Yeah. Just staying on the death, if I may, for a second, in Mark's account of the death of Jesus, at the time of his death, the curtain in the temple is ripped into two. Is it top to bottom? The curtain itself, symbolizing, if you like, the end of this holy of holies, this separate place in the temple where God lives. Now that's gone, suggesting perhaps, I don't know, but maybe the accessibility of God or something. Interestingly, in Luke, it's different. The temple is torn, but it's not when Jesus dies. It's before that, if I remember rightly. So that significance of the death is kind of subtly changed, subtly removed.
That's one of those details that, those of us who want to argue that there's no atonement in Luke and Acts, that's one of those details we'll point to say it's just a slight difference, but it could be important.
Yeah, I think the devil's, well, not the literal devil, but the devil's in the details. You really can tell us something significant. But it's something, Del, I don't understand, and that is, from the beginning of Luke, you get the sense that, when Jesus goes into the temple and he preaches that today this Isaiah scroll has become, has come true in Jesus that day, and it's all about, he mentions also that how certain prophets and figures in the Old Testament who are not part of Israel were favored by God, implying that God is going to go to the Gentiles. But in Acts, if I'm not mistaken, it's only really with Peter in Acts 10, Acts 11, this Cornelius episode where Cornelius is a Roman centurion, of course, a God-fearing one, perhaps, sympathetic with Judaism. But Peter has a vision, this extraordinary vision of a sheet with animals coming down from the sky. And the lesson from that seems to be that the gospel is now to go to the Gentiles, that there are no favorites anymore, that God is for everyone. But why does Peter, in Luke's scheme of things, seem like he's only really hearing it now at that point with the Cornelius episode, if we have all the preceding, including Jesus' own ministry, which seems so leaning towards, suggestive and pointing towards Gentile inclusion in salvation? See what I mean? I don't understand why it's such a oh my God, I couldn't possibly accept this, says Peter initially. There seems to be resistance and almost surprise that he's not heard this kind of thing before. And yet it seems to be indicated strongly in the gospel preceding it. You see what I mean?
Oh, God, Paul. You've asked like a million questions, and I don't even know where to start. Okay, let me start with where you ended up, if I heard you correctly, which was, where was Peter in all this?
Yeah.
So, like everything else that, my scholarship is predicated on, which is going to be what you're going to get, I am a historical skeptic. I basically say, we affirm things from a historical point of view when we have the kind of evidence that we would expect for, George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or, whoever.
Right.
Nat Turner, some slave in South Carolina. What is the evidence? Where do we go?
Mm-hmm.
And so that comes to be the primary sort of thing. But that's not what I think most people want to hear about. They want to hear about what I think about Jesus or Paul or early Christianity or something. I'm not sure. But so I'm constantly shifting between the historical me and the theological me.
Right.
And I can't get those two things completely together at the same time.
No.
And I don't think that's a problem. I just go, if I'm writing an article for a historical journal, I just put on my historical hat and I do my historical thing. If I'm writing a sermon for my church, I put on my theological hat and my pastoral hat and I do something else. And these things are two different persona for me. And I don't see that as schizophrenic or weird or bad. I just see it as the way I live my life.
So Peter's sermon in Acts is not historical. Is that, am I inferring correctly? Or
all of the sermons in Acts sound alike. Why would Peter say the same thing using almost the same vocabulary on, the day of Pentecost, and then James used the same, or, some other apostle used the same language
right.
on a different date? I mean, you just take the speeches in Acts, just take all the speeches in Acts and line them up.
Right.
And they say, and just say, do these look like they were written by 20 different people?
That reminds me of a different subject, which hopefully we'll come to another time, the Gospel of John. But the speeches in John, where you get Jesus speaking, or John the Baptist speaking, or other people speaking, they all kind of sound similar, as if the same kind of person is using the same kind of language and intonation and so on. And that's just struck me as a parallel.
I'll give you a challenge. Try to take a Bible. If you can read Greek and you want to take a Greek New Testament, use that. If you can't, just take several different Bibles and start off in John and mark with a colored pen where the initial, the beginning of a quotation begins. Open quotation mark, the two little inverted commas.
Yeah.
Okay, so note that. And then go down the page and try to find out where the closed quotation marks are. And they're in totally different places in different Bibles. And it's because scholars have never been able to, of course, there were no quotation marks in the ancient world.
No.
And so they're a medieval invention. So where do modern scholars think Jesus stopped talking in John chapter 6?
Right.
Because he talks for a long time.
Yeah.
And some editors put the closed quotation marks at one place, and some put them several verses later, and some put them several verses later, and some have the whole chapter in Jesus's voice, as if it was like the red letter, edition of the New Testament.
I didn't know that. I didn't realize the modern Bibles differed so much on where Jesus begins and ends his speeches. I'll certainly try that exercise.
John is the best example. You really can't tell from the Gospel of John where Jesus stops and the author of the Gospel starts. You just can't tell.
Yeah. I was aware that I think John chapter 3, so 3:16, that the famous verse, but that whole passage is, is this John speaking? Is it Jesus speaking? Who is the speaker? And it's unclear to me anyway who it is. So you're saying the speeches in Acts are, at the very least, filtered through the vocabulary and modes of expression of Luke, rather than reportage, actual, verbatim statements from the guys themselves, who would have said these things, Peter, John, etc., 40, 50 years previous to the actual manuscript being written, if the dating you suggested is reliable. So how would Luke anyway know what they were saying?
I don't even think it was the expectation from historians who wrote in the 1st and 2nd century that they were supposed to reproduce everything exactly. We have rhetorical handbooks where boys, and sometimes girls, but mostly boys, were taught okay, pretend you're Alexander the Great trying to get your troops to go forward into a very dangerous, battle in Gallipoli. Now write the speech, memorize it, and present it to the rest of the class.
Right.
And that's what you did that day.
Right.
That was your education. And so I just imagine that, and when historians talk about, in the ancient world, talk about this, they also do the same thing. Thucydides talks quite explicitly about how reliable his speeches are. Now, sometimes he exaggerates, and we can tell because we go, no, it's anachronistic. Nobody could have thought of that in the year, 360. But we still analyze them. But we know the Thucydides thought that he was writing his own speeches. Now, he was supposed to write them as if Helen of Troy had actually said this.
So these are imaginative constructions based on what the author expected that person, Helen of Troy, to say on that occasion, given the circumstances at that time. It wasn't, let me get this transcript of her words and, put it in my text. No, it was what she should have said or would have said in that context.
Exactly. You always wrote, what should someone have said? Now, this is what's baffled me for years about the Acts of the Apostles. Are Paul's 3 different descriptions of his so-called conversion, of his call. Why did the author of Acts not edit 2 of these out? Why did the author of Acts not try to harmonize them? I mean, there are direct oppositions, just absolute contradictions.
Yeah.
Why would the author of Acts want to present Paul as so blatantly contradicting himself 3 different times in Roman courts? That just doesn't make any sense to me.
That's a good point. And that's one of the mysteries of history. We won't know, of course. We can't ask Luke why he did that. Because on one of the occasions, Paul sees something, and other people hear something, and then Paul hears something, and there are contradictions. So we're not quite sure exactly what happened in any case. But any theories as to why he included 3 accounts, discrepant, mutually contradictory accounts? Maybe he's not as great a historian as we would hope he would be.
I just don't. That's the thing. I just don't know. I mean, I respect the writer of Luke and Acts as a writer. I think he was a brilliant first century writer. The Greek is some of the best Greek we have in the Bible. It's very, the German term Bildung, educated. It's very educated. But why he would include those 3 stories, I am confused about.
And the other thing that confuses me is, given that we understand, or we're told, that Luke knew Paul, they were companions, and indeed halfway through Luke suddenly changes from a third-person account, they, to we, a first-person account, we meaning the author and Paul. And yet his chronology of Paul's life, his movements around the ancient world, but also his theology, Paul's understanding of salvation, of Jesus, is often quite different from what we read in the authentic letters, the 7 authentic letters in the New Testament. So did Luke know Paul, the historical Paul, or is that just a kind of when he says we, is that kind of a literary device to kind of make us believe that he knew him but didn't?
Well, I basically say whoever wrote Luke Acts was not Luke, the historical Luke,
right?
Who could have known Paul. And probably didn't know Paul.
Yeah.
I don't think the author who wrote Luke and Acts knew Paul at all. I don't think he knew Paul's letters. I don't know that he even knew that Paul wrote letters, because there's just no reference to it. Paul, he just has a totally different conception of Paul than Paul had of himself, I think we can safely say.
Yeah.
As far as who it was, I just don't think we can have any clue. Like I say, it wasn't the historical Luke who was maybe a companion of Paul and maybe knew Paul or other people like that first generation. I don't think whoever wrote Luke Acts was that person, but who it was.
No, because as you say, Luke is the writer is a very educated person. Their Greek is very good, so you'd expect them to take similar care with their sources and their accounts. And yet, as you say, his understanding of Paul's life, movements, theology is so at variance with what we know of the historical Paul that it doesn't add up. So yeah, what you're saying kind of makes sense.
I think, though, we also may need to think about just the process of transmission. Luke may have been discriminated against as a document, or Luke Acts as a 2-volume document. What if some of the surprises that we have are the result of a spotty history of transmission? I mean, I just don't know. I think that it's a very complicated issue. It's even one of the things I keep thinking is complicated is, why did they split up Luke and Acts in the first place in the canon? You know, why didn't they keep them together? But anyway, I just find Luke and Acts a fascinating, never-ending problem.
It does throw up more questions than answers, and the more you look into it, the kind of raises even more questions. And well, perhaps we'll draw it to a close there. But I hope this has been of interest to viewers, as it has been to me. And if you want to read more on the background to this whole question and on the whole New Testament, do get yourself a copy of New Testament History and Literature by Del Martin, published by Yale University Press. It's available on Amazon, if I'm allowed to say Amazon, and very, very interesting indeed. So thank you very much, Dale, for your time. And before we end, I'm hoping we can come back another time to talk about the Gospel of John, which is thank you, is such a significant gospel for the church. And again, there are more surprises perhaps in store with that.
All over the place. Too many problems.
Yeah, but nevertheless, it's worth talking about. So thank you very much, Dale, for your time. And we look forward to you again. Thank you. Till next.